our having a regional piece that's based on initiatives for the Pacific. So could you please welcome Lisa? Thank you.
Day, everyone. It's so beautiful to be back in your country, and it's so wonderful. I've told Annette at least 3 times today how much growth I've seen in IPAN in the past decade. That's really remarkable. I know sometimes it feels thankless and it feels like we're not making a whole lot of progress, but as an external set of eyes looking in, I think that's very evident. As I begin my talk, I wanted to first, in my own way, pay homage to the traditional landowners, and so I'll do that now. Manotigit gisan hilo iman omko na totlang siha, za intina iman mataw, iman mofana na tataw ni matuk iman finena na nasagman siha, intina iman yainan mommy, za intina iman omko na totlang siha. And so this is paying homage to the bones on which we stand over in this land. And so, can we dim the lights? Oftentimes the question is, where exactly is Guam? And I try really hard to explain it, but this I found online, which is the AUKUS map. And as you can see, I put in a blue star there, Perth, or at least I believe that's where Perth is. And then you see the middle star. That is the tiny place in which my home is situated in the North Pacific, in the Micronesian region of the Pacific in the Mariana Island chain. And then the third blue star is that of China, which of course is always the ultimate topic of discussion when we look at peace issues in the Asia Pacific. And so the nice thing about PowerPoint is we get to use maps, and this is one that I love because it does have our island situated in the middle. And what you can see there with Australia to the south of the island, and really from, if you draw a straight line up, relatively straight line up from Australia, you'll eventually run into our home island, which is why we share the time zone with Sydney, as well as Brisbane, I believe. Okay, and so this map was actually shared with us by some military folks, Department of Defense folks, in one of their presentations to our government leaders. And it is really revealing to me because what it does is you see highlighted in red arrows a number of the different military triangles of exercises in the way that they conceptualize our region. And as you can see, it spans over from my island to Hawaii, which is the center of the Pacific Command. And then you see stretched up, especially in terms of the Navy, activities to San Diego, California. And in some maps, they go all the way up to Alaska and then down through Japan and through the rest of our region. And I don't want to spend too much time reiterating what I shared last night, but as you know, we are a US unincorporated territory. My people, we are called Chamorros, have endured over 350 years of continuous colonization, stemming from the time of colonization by the Spanish. They first claimed us in the mid-1600s, and then changing hands after the Spanish-American War to the United States. We were occupied during World War II by the Japan Imperial Army for 3 years, and then back to the American hands. And you can see here this caricature more like his dad every day, and you can see how we're really, this is very graphically representative of really the way they conceptualize us as people in how we engage the great United States of the America. I wanted to spend a little bit of time in light of the theme of AUKUS, focusing on the nuclear story, which has become centered as one of the pillars of AUKUS with the submarines that are anticipated to, or maybe not, from the discussions of the day, to be here in Australia. And so I share this map that is from a report that was commissioned by IPAN, and it was developed, the report was developed by Nick McClellan from Melbourne. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. And it pretty much plots out the different places where there's been test sites across the Pacific. And so of course we have the British, the Americans, and the French who have done testing throughout this region. And this nuclear quote unquote legacy has really proven very problematic for us. I wanted to share a little bit more and zone into the Micronesian part of the story, which really converged on the Marshall Islands, a number of islands to include Bikini, as well as Enewetak, as well as Rongelap, 3 islands of the Marshall Islands that were heavily bombarded through this testing period. And so as you may or may not know, there were 67 nuclear tests between 1946 and 1958 that was detonated in the Marshall Islands. In the words of the former Marshall's ambassador to the UN, Mr. Tony de Brum, he shares that what happened in the Marshall Islands is the equivalent of 1.7 Hiroshima bombs every day for a 12-year period, right? So wrap your mind around that for a second. A major assault on these islands. And in terms of complicity, wherein we're being, as communities, being used by the United States or having been used as pawns in its militarist agenda, our island or our region of the Mariana Islands, an island to the north of us, which is also territory of indigenous Chamorro people, the island of Tinian, is where the 2 bombs were actually kept and stored. That was what was detonated on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so you can imagine when we share space with people from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the kind of apology that we offer, the flowers that we place at their feet for being complicit in the suffering that they endured. This slide was shared with me by an activist from the Marshall Islands, Abaca Anjan Madison, who does a lot of global work. She actually presented testimony before the UN with the TPMW testimonies. And so this is very illustrative of what we call the human radiation experiments. There's actually a book called The Human Radiation Experiments, and it does talk about the atomic, or the communities that have been impacted by radiation. And really, I mean, there's just no excuse for what we see there. Here you see a lot of burns, and this was during the direct time of detonation. In terms of human suffering and what we've seen in the Marshalls following detonation was the birthing of what are referred to as jellyfish babies, which essentially are babies without bones, as well as, and over time, it kind of morphed into different shapes and forms, later followed by birth defects that you could see physically, as well as different conditions such as autism in children. And the most recent that Abaca has shared with us that they're seeing include 2 things. One, babies being born without eyeballs, as well as babies being born with tails, or what looks like tails. I wanted to share this slide, and this was actually provided to me by Mr. Robert Celestial from the Pacific Association of Radiation Survivors on my home island. And what this slide communicates is the radius of exposure of radiation. So while detonation occurred in 3 islands in the Marshall Islands, because of direct downwinds, and we are within that direct flow, the radiation that was reported on our islands on a number of days was higher than even the levels that were reported on Majuro, which is the capital of the Marshall Islands. And that's largely due to where the winds brought the radiation. And so we have here in this picture, Mr. Robert Celestial, who is the president of the Pacific Association of Radiation Survivors, with Lieutenant Bert Schreiber, who is now deceased, but he was able to sign a sworn affidavit indicating that when he was stationed in the military on Guam, that the geyser counters, and you can see the quote here, were all the major bombs in the Marshall Islands. We actually, during the Clinton administration, they had declassified a whole bunch of documents, and we were able in a very small window period of time to get those declassified documents that clearly evidence the exposure of our island to radiation. And so in terms of situating, I was asked to talk about the Pacific and our work in terms of peace. And so I wanted to situate it in our genealogy over time. Many of you in the room may have been a part of this, and it's a time in our history that I really long for, because I came into this work after the NFIP movement. But clearly the nuclear free and independent Pacific movement was very critical. It first began in 1975 in Fiji. It was a non-government organization. And so it was a network across the Pacific that had a complementary nonprofit leg called the Pacific Concerns Resource Center, or PCRC. They were able to put on a series of conferences and looked very closely and very staunchly in terms of being able to maintain the position that we didn't want any nuclear activity in the Pacific. And in the NFIP, the I, which is independent part of Pacific, which is so ironic that you have an I in IPAN, was actually added later in recognition of the territories of us in the Pacific who continue to live under old school colonial rule as Guam continues to do today. And so part of NFIP, they adopted the People's Charter for a Nuclear-Free and Independent Pacific. And you can see there's a number of different Pacific countries that have enshrined till this day nuclear-free constitutions. In Micronesia, we have the Republic of Belau, who were very, very active, and it even led to the assassination of a president at one point in the Republic of Belau on the question of the nuclear question and the militarization of their islands. And so in the charter, we have the preambular that states, we note in particular the recent racist roots of the world's nuclear powers, and we call for an immediate end to the oppression, exploitation, and subordination of the indigenous people of the Pacific. We, the people of the Pacific, will assert ourselves and wrest control over the destiny of our nations and our environment from foreign powers, including the transnational corporations. Very strong, very centered in our Pacificness and in the protection of our homelands, ultimately. Moving forward, okay, thank you for that. Moving forward, there's been some reference today in the discussions of the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty, often referred to as the Treaty of Rarotonga, which is the city in which it was, the place in which it was signed. And so the South Pacific Forum adopted this in their 13th meeting in Rarotonga, Cook Islands, and that was in August of 1985. And this treaty specifically indicated that there would be no manufacturing or possession of nuclear weapons, no atomic testing, no radioactive waste or matter in the Pacific. And the countries that signed on to it are listed here. And of course, today the US hasn't ratified this treaty, which is not surprising by any stretch. More recently, the Pacific Island Forum, which continues to meet today, had a meeting in 2019. And the PIF leaders, in their meeting, they mandated the carry out of the provisions of the Treaty of Rarotonga. And subsequently in December of the following year, the first state parties meeting was held to commemorate the 35-year anniversary of the adoption of the treaty. And so consequently, they created a Nuclear Legacies Task Force to assist nuclear survivors in the Marshall Islands as well as in Kiribati, which are both in Micronesia. 2 minutes. Oh my goodness, you're tough. Okay. And so the strengths and gaps of the treaty, I mean, it wasn't perfect. There's lots of gaps, and the biggest gap really is with regards to accountability, particularly with AUKUS and the accountability of Australia in having the nuclear submarines. I wanted to mention a little bit about the treaty and the TPNW, which I'm sure IPAN and Australia is very familiar with. It's still in the process of signatories. One thing I wanted to mention though, and this is with no disrespect whatsoever, but if you notice on the list of people who've signed on to the treaty, the Marshall Islands hasn't. And that is a very intentional decision on their part. And so I wanted to share a little bit from the president, Hilda Heine, who states that, quote, "We support the treaty because it's good for the world. But one of the reasons that Marshall Islands has not ratified the treaty is one of the articles that speaks to state parties being responsible for cleaning nuclear damage on their islands and lands and being responsible for the health of their own people. We're not ready to absolve the US of its responsibility." And so that's a really critical point for them because they do negotiate a compact of free association with the US that gets negotiated every decade or so, and they're up on their renegotiation. And so as much as they support the aspirational intent of the treaty, it's something that would be counter for them in their negotiations. Okay, I'm going to skip through this because I got 1 minute now. Nick McClellan, who I mentioned earlier, is really this amazing journalist that is so well informed, but what he had done at the time that AUKUS was announced was got quotes from different heads of state throughout the Pacific. And so I just wanted to share a few of these quotes that are really powerful in terms of the Pacific taking a very strong stance, particularly with the provision of the nuclear presence. And so, for example, the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands said, "We would like to keep our region nuclear free and put the region's nuclear legacy behind us. We do not support any form of militarization in our region that could threaten regional and international peace and stability." And we see the same sentiment echoed by different leaders throughout the Pacific. And so this really just reminds us in terms of disarmament, the importance of the implementation of not just the TPNW, but also the Treaty of Rarotonga and all anti-nuclear agreements. And in that light, we can't forget still the need for compensation, especially for healthcare costs, which is the biggest challenge for people in the Marshall Islands and in the cleanup of their region. Humanity does not possess the technology to clean nuclear anything. And so it's for that reason, and we see this over and over again in different cases, and so it's for that reason that we really need to just take nuclear off the table as best as we can. Thank you.